this world. Give I African style. Give I, 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 give I and I style.
Hello, welcome. So I'm going to start off this presentation in the words of Fela Kuti. He says, "You Africans, listen to me as Africans. And you non-Africans, listen to me with open mind." So you might ask, what does it mean to listen as an African? If you identify in that way. And if you don't, you might also ask, what does it mean, if you're non-African, you might ask, what does it mean to listen with an open mind? So the purpose of this presentation, this is a primer, you might say, for the class, our Afrofuturism class. And the purpose of this presentation is to learn how to listen like an African, or learn some of the cultural and philosophical and spiritual kind of foundations and worldview that is central to African and African cultures. And we're also going to be investigating this question of, is there a unitary African culture? Are there many African cultures? The relationship between Black and African and so on. And what is the general kind of orientation that allows us to, when we talk about Afrofuturism, like what is the Afro in the Afrofuturism? So we want to get that first, or we want to at least have a conversation about it, or we at least want to orient ourselves in that direction before we jump into the class. So with that, I'm going to take a bow. And I'm going to dedicate this bow to the collective struggle of Black people for liberation, for the breaking of all the chains of oppression, all chains of oppression, and for the awakening and the alleviation of suffering and the establishment of justice for all beings. We'll do our little part. Okay, so I'm going to get into the presentation here. Okay. So presentation is called Ancestry in Progress, Pan-Africanist Worldviews and Astro-Blackness. And that title, Ancestry in Progress, comes from a Zap Mama album. And I think she picked that title up from someone else. So there it is. There's that Ancestry in Progress. There's that transmission of language and of ideas and of purpose over time. So anyways, in it. So one of the first questions I think we can ask ourselves in terms of establishing or questioning after an African or Black worldview is, whose view are we talking about, right? At Naropa and in many academic settings, and almost as a default setting in our world, right? In our society, in a society that is recovering from European colonization, there's an assumption that the epistemological or the way of defining and establishing and creating and investigating knowledge that comes out of Europe for the last several centuries since the Enlightenment is basically a universal way, and or that it is the most correct way if it isn't universal. And so one of the things that we're really looking at here and really trying to put forth is that every epistemology actually comes out of a historical perspective. It comes out of a certain vantage point and a certain moment in history and a certain position, you might say, in a dynamic or dynamics of power, right? So whose view, whose eyes are we looking through? And those are the eyes there at the Lotus Monk, you might recognize, but whose eyes are we looking through in this class? And how do we look with and listen with a set of African eyes or ears, or Black eyes and ears? So a set of concepts that's helpful from the anthropological world that is utilized by one of the thinkers I'll be presenting today is called the emic and edict perspectives, right? And so you can see here that an edict perspective is a perspective that is external or outside of a particular culture that it's studying, right? And if we go into almost any library, CU, Naropa, academic libraries all over the country, if not the world, you'll see scores and scores of books that are written about Africa and African peoples, and they are written from and by European scholars or from a Western perspective that comes from outside of Africa. Okay, so that's the edict perspective. The emic perspective is really about a culture or a society looking from its own values and its own philosophical perspectives and its own imperatives at itself and studying itself, right? It's a society or culture studying itself from the inside. So we're seeking to develop an emic perspective to some extent in this class, at least if for those that identify as African or as Black. So if we want to talk about, Pan-Africanism, one of the first people that we can start with is Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey was originally from Jamaica, and he immigrated to the United States in the early 20th century. And he was of the belief that due to the treatment of Black people in the Western Hemisphere, under the reign of white supremacy and colonialism, he was of the belief that the Western world was not a home for Black people, and that relationships between white people and Black people were not going to be on equal footing unless Black people were actually standing on their own soils. So he was an advocate of repatriation of all the people of the Black and African diaspora in the Western world. He was an advocate of repatriation to Africa, and he saw the cultural perspectives of Black people all over the world, whether we were living on the African continent or whether we were in the United States or Barbados or Brazil and so on, as he saw that entire diaspora as one kind of whole or under one cultural umbrella. And so one term for that, and I'm not sure if Garvey himself was a developer of this term, is Pan-Africanism, right? So he advocated an all Black unity worldwide. Marcus Garvey was a controversial figure in part because of his ideas of separatism, and actually at points he even would conversate with the Ku Klux Klan because they were sort of on the same page that they wanted a strict separation between the races. And again, his separation wasn't so much about the hate of white people as it was about the dignity of Black people and a reclamation of self-respect of Black people and empowering and building Africa up into the great civilization that it once was in his eyes. So Marcus Garvey, one early proponent of Pan-Africanism. So this is a quote by Marcus Garvey, and you probably heard it through Bob Marley. Marcus Garvey was a big inspiration for the Rastafarian movement, which we may touch on later on in this class. But I think this quote it illustrates something that's key in terms of the Black subjectivity or the Black subject, which is that, you know, behind our discourse in Europa, we have this idea of liberation or enlightenment, right? Coming from Buddhist traditions, that there's this sort of state of ultimate psychological clarity where you've really stepped out of a lot of the habits that create suffering. And the way that that has spread into the United States and into, you might call, the New Age scene, is this idea that we can kind of just think ourselves or will ourselves or intend ourselves out of any situation. And for the Black subject, that idea of enlightenment or liberation is not real for the Black subjectivity. It's liberation has to be economic, it has to be political, it has to be cultural, and it has to be psycho-spiritual, right? So it's a complete liberation that the Black subject or the Black mentality is seeking, according to Marcus Garvey, right? So breaking physical and mental spiritual chains. So what does it really mean then if we're going to put Africa in the center, or the Black worldviews in the center of our vision? What does that really mean? And how is it composed? So just a fun side note for folks, that set of concentric circles there is part of a symbol system from Ghana called the Ndinkra symbol, or Ndinkra symbolism. And there are these ideographs that hold, or like they're kind of stores of traditional knowledge, wisdom, folklore, folk sayings, and so on. And the Ndinkra symbol that you're seeing there is called the Ndinkra Rene, or Dinkrane. I think I'm pronouncing that, Ndinkrane. And it's kind of like one of the generators of the rest of the symbol. It's kind of called the king of the Ndinkra symbol system. So that's just a fun side note. We'll probably return to the Ndinkra symbols throughout the semester. So one source of Afrocentric theory and philosophy is this gentleman here, Molefi Asante, and he's a professor of African American studies at Temple University. And in one of his books, got it here, the Afrocentric Idea, he talks about, he describes Afrocentricity as placing African ideals at the center of any analysis that involves African culture and behavior, okay? So, as we probably know at this point, part of the colonization process was to sever Black people from our languages, and through the severance of our languages and also music, from our whole kind of cultural center, right? And it was to kind of take Black people and make us think that we had to be like white people, and that was, that was how you become human, is by being white and by thinking white and by taking on Christianity and taking on the ways of thinking that had been developed in Western Europe during the Enlightenment and Renaissance period, right? That's the measure of what it is to be human. And so as a result, you have Black people who are severed from themselves and are chasing after something that when they look in the mirror, they can't be, okay? So you have a decentered person, a disembodied person, okay? So the Afrocentric idea is about recentering Black subjectivity and being centered in our own histories, our own myths, values, cosmologies, and in this case, and in this class, futures. And it's for Asante, it's not enough to just be Black or just be African. It's an actual active agency, okay? And it's an actual world building through the African lens or prism. And this isn't the intent, this isn't the primary intent, but part of what will end up happening there is a decentering of Eurocentric worldviews as universal, as neutral or natural, or as the most scientific, okay? Because again, we've all inherited, and by that I mean black, white, brown, indigenous, so on. We've all inherited, or we've been forced to inherit or accept this idea that the Eurocentric worldview is the most developed view. And that if you really want to get to the truth, that's the way to do it, right? So Asante is saying, by asserting African agency, we are decentering Europe, and not necessarily for all peoples centering Africa. It's for Black people, right? Afrocentricity is for Black people. And what it does is it creates, instead of a European center, it creates a multiplicity, right? It creates a council, you might even say, okay? So anyway, he thinks that the Afrocentricity is crucial not only to Black people, but it's crucial to developing a multicultural society and a global community where there's actually like a pluralism. So in Naropa, we talk a lot, we have this metaphor about let the East and the West like collide, right? And the sparks will fly. Okay, we see Naropa as the academic traditions of the Western world meeting the mindfulness traditions of the Buddhist, particularly Tibetan Buddhist world, okay, at least in its origin, all right? And that initial combination was the spark that created the school, and it also became this invitation for different spiritual traditions to come and have counsel with one another. And you can go to the Lincoln Building on the Arapahoe campus on that middle platform, and there's that beautiful banner with the will of the Dharma, and then symbols from all over, from religious traditions all over the world, the so-called great religions. And what I noticed there, and what other folks might notice there, is that there is no symbol there that represents Black Africa, or that is indigenous to Africa, okay? And part of that is because until very recently, you know, the world religions dialogue was primarily hosted and controlled from a Eurocentric point of view. And Africa was seen as not being, as having anything to contribute to the great world religions, okay? So Asante is like, hold on. And his view is that, okay, the East and the West both make these sort of fundamental propositions about what reality is, right? That's that ontology, right? That's this word that we're working with because we speak English, right? We each one, the East and the West, have these kind of fundamental propositions. Reality is composed of this. According to him, the East's fundamental proposition is what he calls spiritualism, or that reality is fundamentally consciousness, okay? It's fundamentally awareness. You know, if some of you all who are studying in you know, yoga studies, you get into the Vedas, at a certain point, consciousness is the fundamental makeup of reality or awareness, and that everything else is kind of impossible without consciousness or reducible to consciousness. The West, on the other hand, has this doctrine of materialism, okay? The fundamental unit of reality is the billiard ball, is the atom, right? And you can go all the way through back to ancient Greece. You can go to Democritus and his idea that there were these sort of immutable monads that you could get to the smallest thing, right? And now we actually know that that's not quite true, at least from the Western scientific perspective in terms of the quantum realm, which we'll hopefully address and touch in this class too. But that's the fundamental proposition, material, right? So East, West. Asante's assertion is that the South, okay, the Sudan, the South, Africa, the fundamental unit of reality is actually the person, okay? Now, you might be like, wait, how? Okay? There's this problem in Western philosophy of science, right? This question of, like, if we look at the rainbow, is the rainbow, there's a claim by Western science and philosophers of science that the rainbow isn't real, that it's an epiphenomenon, and it only exists because of the human eye. Okay, but in a way, everything that we perceive only exists because we exist as the perceivers, right? The whole world is basically in reference to us, and that's different. It's different than being self-centered and naive. It's simply saying that everything that we look, see, touch, hear, it all comes into being through our senses. Would green be green without the eye? Would there be sound without the ear? With the vibrations of energy that travel around in the universe, would they be like, how do they become a world? They become a world because there is a person through which they become, right? So his view is that the world is made of persons in a way. Okay, the fundamental unit is the person. And not only is the world made of persons, made by persons, it is made of persons. In other words, we are living in a reality full of subjectivities. We are living in a reality of entities. And the way that you negotiate with entities is through communication, is through speech, and we'll get into that a bit later, right? But his idea is that the person is the fundamental, and it's almost as if, the East and the West have created these sort of polar extremes to examine something, right? But pure matter without a living creature to know it and notice it, pointless. And pure spirit, we don't actually experience pure spirit, right? They're both sort of extremes that are being pulled out of the person. And if you let them back go, the place where they meet is actually here. Okay, so personalism. And as a result, if the person is the fundamental unit, then you don't design a world to serve material. You don't design a world to serve disembodied spirit. You design a world as the designer around persons and to enhance and to grow and strengthen personality, right? So he also says that to create the world further, all the energy found to create the world further or in the future comes through the person and the person cultivating their energy in concert with others. Because that's the other thing. A person doesn't make sense by themselves. A person is a relational entity and reality is relational. And you can find this in some ways even in the Buddhist teachings as far as, this idea of things mutually arising, right? Okay, and the Taoist 10,000 things. Okay, even Western science is starting to recognize through systems thinking that reality is self-organizing and it's a complex system of relationships. Okay, so personalism, that's kind of the fundamental view coming out of Africa. So what are some of the elements of the Sudic ideal and of Afrocentric aesthetics, right? Because part of Asante's work is he's looking at rhetoric, right? He's looking at literature, and he's looking at like how you critique and evaluate rhetoric and literature and art, and how to do so from the aesthetic viewpoints and philosophical viewpoints that are behind them of Africa or the larger sort of Black world. So he names these six elements here. So the first is Nomo. And Nomo is a word that comes from the Dogon people of Mali. And you can see on the right there's this sort of image of this kind of fish-like creature. And in the Dogon cosmology, they believe that these fish beings are actually from the Sirius star system, right? And they've actually found that the Sirius star system has 2 stars, and it's believed that was found by them before Western science, and you can't actually see the 2 stars in Sirius. And Sirius, if you go outside now, especially during the winter time of the year, it's one of the brightest stars in the sky. But Sirius actually has a binary star around it that's invisible. Okay, so the Dogon believe that these like aquatic-like creatures came from Sirius, and that they helped create the human race. And one of the qualities that makes us human that we share with the Nomos is the power of speech, right? So Nomo has a lot of different meanings in the Dogon language. It's speech, it's breath, it's the word, and it's the breath and the word as our life force, right? As a movement of our life force, right? So in Asante's view, he uses the term nomo, right, to try to start to get us away from just exclusively English terms and philosophies, right? He uses it as a way to describe the centrality of the word in African and Black life and African and Black philosophy. So the word creates reality. Everything that exists, like anything that exists can be named. And what can't be named, he says, can't be known. And what is unknown, does it exist for us? And I don't know if that's, I'm not going to hold that hard, but I think it's an interesting question to consider, right? Another piece is that all acts are acts of communication, okay? When we act as creatures, we are acting in relationship to other creatures and other living beings. And what we do is intelligible, right? And then he also says that one of the, kind of values that exist amongst African and African descendant peoples is this idea that, skill in language actually increases your social status. And your social status actually enables you to have a certain kind of power in language, right? And that they're sort of mutually reinforcing. So like those that are skilled with the word can attain a certain kind of power, and those that have power kind of have to be skilled with the word. There's a lot to that, but basic orientation. A sort of subcategory of this the normal concept is what Asante calls orature, and he contrasts orature with literature, right? So it's oral, and his view is he's kind of countering a lot of the scholarship that is Eurocentric about Africa that basically asserts that Africa is a lower order society or set of civilization or societies because Africans never developed an indigenous written language, which first of all is not true. Okay, it's actually not true. But Asante says, okay, let's just leave that for a second. Here's the thing. In orature, the emphasis is actually on the spoken word rather than the written word. And it's not just an inability, it's a preference. Okay. Now you can, if you go back to, let's say if we're going to go from the Western line, you go into Greek philosophy, you can find in some of the Platonic dialogues, they speak about, because the ancient Greek culture was moving from being a literary or an oral culture to a literary culture. Okay. And they speak about the danger actually of moving to a literate culture, and this idea that people will write words down, they'll write voices down, and they'll think that they know the truth by memorizing these words or by being able to write these words, okay? Whereas in an oral culture where you learn from the mouth of another person, you're in a constant state of being evaluated and tested and worked with and shown. Okay, so there's a teaching that's through relationship, whereas in a book culture we can sit down with books, okay, in a literate culture, and we can read all this stuff, but how do we actually know that we know it, right? It's kind of like the warrior exam. The test is to be able to manifest it through the mouth, and through the mouth is a signature of the whole being, right? It's got to be like real, there has to be real presence that we can communicate. That's that meditation in action, okay? So orature is a preference for the spoken word, okay? He says the spoken word expression is not the captive of the written word, and it's not just it's part of the preference is that the spoken word is flexible and it is responsive in real time, right? When we write things down, we freeze them and we make them objects, we make them material. right? And we think they can be dissected and what have you, okay? Whereas the living word is a vibration, okay? It's happening. And you can't grab it, but you have to understand it and feel it and be changed by it. Okay, so if that's your orientation, is vibratory in the moment, transformational speaking, then you study that as an art and as a practice. Okay, so he talks about orature as like the sum total of oral tradition in the Black world, African diaspora. Another quality he talks about that is particular to, or central, I should say, to an Afrocentric idea is what he calls the Afro-circular or holism, okay? And this is a way of thinking that's synthetic rather than analytic. Rather than seeking to take things apart, you're seeking to find the unities and the relationships between the minis, right? So he talks about how in traditional African societies, the arts, blacksmithing, law, music, relationships, marriage, kingship, right? Or sovereignty, farming, herding, how they all have to fit into some greater whole. And if one part is out of sync with the rest, the parts are so closely woven together that if one part is out of sync, it disrupts the whole. Okay? So in a way, it's a kind of ecological thinking. It's a relational thinking. Okay? He says there's an emphasis on understanding more so than knowledge and information. Okay? It's not just about being able to create a definite pattern of relationships between things. It's really knowing when to use them and why things are there, right? And why they exist in relation to you. It's internalizing and it's being changed by. It's not just having, again, materialism. It's not just about possessing, okay? And he also kind of talks about this idea of the curved line, right? He contrasts the Afro-circular to the Eurolinear, and the Eurolinear is kind of, it's okay with things being fragmented, right? And you see that even in contemporary empirical science-based cosmologies, where they say that the universe is sort of this infinite expanse that just goes on out into forever, or that the universe is inherently entropic and it falls apart. And in the African sensibility, that can't be the end. That's just a situation that we're in until we discover the ways in which the universe is whole and loops back into itself and is an integrated thing. Okay. Now I'm getting way out there, but this is Afrofuturism, so let's go. Anyway, the curved line, the circular, the interrelated, the whole, and this leads us to our next point, the harmonious. Okay. So he talks about harmony. And I'm just going to read the whole passage here. I think it's a really powerful passage. He says, the African finds energy and life in the midst of persons. He or she does not escape to the mountains or valleys or seashores to find the energy. There is no great tradition of withdrawal in the African or African American tradition. Ours is preeminently a tradition of remarkable encountering with others. All would-be Thoreaus are baptized in the fires of human excitement because it is only through the give and take of Nomo that we find energy, not in lives of solitude. Nothing is more beautiful to me than when a group of people have got on the same road to harmony at the same moment. That is the true manifestation of spirituality, the true materiality of life, which can only be determined when the person joins in the collective expression of power. I am no longer myself. I am a transpersonal being at this moment of collective expression. And later on he says, if I go out to the seashore If I go out to be alone, I only do so so that I can return and be in a new or more complete way with others. Right? So the place where the loop closes is in relationship. And I think that this idea of harmony, right? If we're talking about a Black or African or Afrocentric spirituality being at the table, let's say at Naropa, at the table of world wisdom, I think this is a key teaching, and it's a key offering that Black people have to share with the world at this time. You know, we hear so much and we say so much here. I can only fix myself. I can only work on myself, right? And we have these monastic traditions, which I think have been somewhat distorted and taken out of context from um, parts of Asia and even in the European tradition, where it looks like you can go out into the woods and be enlightened, or to the mountain by yourself. Or you can go on the hero's journey. But what? The whole thing with the hero's journey at the end is you got to come back to the village. And you have to show people what you learned. And you go out in part, not just for your own questing, but really to help the village. Okay? So that, I think that has a lot of bearing on our ideas of enlightenment, on our ideas of healing, on our ideas of justice. Okay? It's circular, it's coming back, it's whole. And it's also that, like, enlightenment isn't something that really is attained alone. It's witnessed, it's held, and it's propelled. People reach these moments of enlightenment by being propelled by others and in relationship to others. That kind of leads me to the next point. Rhythm. Okay. So Asante says that, you know, rhythm is first of all, rhythm's like a cosmic principle, right? It's being in synchrony and playing with personal, social, natural, cosmic, spiritual periodicity. Okay, the coming in and out of everything. Everything is a wave phenomenon. It appears, and then it appears to disappear, and then it returns. And there's an expectancy about the whole thing, right? There's a fluency about the whole thing. Okay. He talks about music as central for African transcendence. It is a central, let's say, spiritual technology, right? We study the spiritual or the psychotechnology or the contemplative technology of meditation, of sitting practice, right? He points to music as a central technology in African and African American methods or roads to enlightenment or transcendence. He also talks about the call and response, right? Call and response is part of this rhythmic pattern. It's he talks about, in a lot of traditional African music, you have the leader, or not the leader, but you have a person who sings an original line and then a chorus that repeats or replies to that line. Okay, so there's a kind of feedback relationship that people are in, and they loop and gather and play with and transform and refine and spiral up or down or out energy. Okay. And you know, as beings, definitely as Black people, Asante is asserting, and I also support this idea, but I think as beings, we want to be heard, we want to be felt, we don't want to speak into the emptiness, we don't want to act into the emptiness. It's got to be seen, it's got to be witnessed, it's got to be responded to, right? And in that back and forth, that's how you create worlds, right? So call and response. And he talks about the most developed state of African harmony, of transcendence, he refers to as possession. Now, this has been another point where anthropologists and ethnographers and religious studies folks have critiqued Africa and basically said that African religion is about trance, and it's about losing yourself and being taken over. And Asante contrasts possession with trance. He says real possession, he talks about it as having There's no unshared edges, no hanging questions, no impossible dreams at the moment of feeling. You're in something, okay? And it's a complete state of non-separation and of being in a fullness, okay? He says this state can't be reached without an expenditure of energy. It has to be sought, right? Trance is a passive thing that happens to somebody. Possession is something that someone seeks, and it's something that a community seeks, he says, right? And it happens in a communal setting. It doesn't happen to everyone in the setting, but some people are more receiving it and some people are in it, okay? So he talks about, you know, a lot of the traditions like that grow out of, let's say, Ifa, that you don't get possessed by the gods, you reach up and touch the gods. You embody their energy. Okay? It's an achievement. It's not something that befalls a person. Lots more to say about that. Another piece, improvisation. Okay? He talks about there's a preference of talent over technical skill, over spontaneity, or spontaneity over rules, accidents over rigid form, right? You can see this in music, sometimes in a lot of European music, classical music, right? As if that was the only classical, as if different peoples didn't have their own classical. And you hear this sometimes spoken of in terms of Indian classical music, right? The West and the East are recognized as centers of intelligence, but not the South. Okay. You don't just play the notes. You don't just adhere to the form. You have to possess the form with soul. And you got to actually have something to say. Right? Like in the moment of artistic creation, right? In the moment of speech, in the moment of sport, right? There's a communication that has to happen, right? There's a transmission that has to happen. There, you possess the form with life, and then the form becomes unpredictable and, you know, joyous, maybe. Okay, so I think this is really similar to what we talk about at Naropa with nowness. Okay, there's a preference for immediacy. It has to have an energy that kind of brings things down and brings things to a point, and an energy that is like kind of irresistible and then breaks through people's ability to check out, right? And if the form is set, then you can kind of go to sleep. But if there's improvisation, you really have to be there in the moment, paying attention, and you have to be in a state of total like feeling with the situation. Okay, so so this is a question, you know, Black or African or, and I raise this for a few different reasons. First of all, some of Asante's critics, even amongst Black scholars, feel that he's an essentialist. Okay, right? They feel that he is making universalizing statements about all Black people. And he's saying that there are qualities that are inherent to Black people. Now, essentialism is problematic in a lot of ways because essentialism was the kind of technique of the white supremacist view and of patriarchy and of other kind of oppressions that are based off of you have this kind of body or you are from this part of the earth and you're like this. And it's unchangeable. And Asante is saying, he's not talking about the Afrocentric ideal or the Sudic ideal as something that is necessarily inborn. It's that it's culture and it's transmitted and it's preserved and it endures. And it endures because it serves life. Right? And that's what you do. You transmit it from generation to generation and person to person. And he also asserts that even in the diaspora when Black people had our language suppressed and our music suppressed and our instruments suppressed, okay? And we're basically forbidden from practicing culture outside of the narrow kind of culture that existed or was enforced in the plantations. He says that even in that situation, there were ways of moving, there were ways of seeing, there were ways of speaking a foreign language, ways of speaking it, that orality and that these orientations towards harmony, towards improvisation, towards holism survived. Okay, and that they took on a new form and adapted, and sometimes were malformed and sometimes transformed beneficially in the diaspora, right? So he's asserting that there's a unitary, he's a Pan-Africanist, he's asserting there's a unitary African world culture on both sides of the Atlantic. It shares certain unitary qualities, although it is multitudinous. Okay, and you know the difference between Black people in America and Jamaica culturally, there's many, but he asserts that there's underlying similarities between the Black person in the United States, in Jamaica, and in Ghana. Now, even in the Black community or Black diasporic communities, there is this question of does Black mean African? And there are some Black folks that don't identify as African. And you see that picture here from Black Panther, and this was kind of one of the central questions in the movie is, do continental Africans see diasporic Africans as part of a family of Africa? And do Black people in the diaspora see themselves as part of the family and maybe accepted in the family of Africa? So I'm holding that as an open question that maybe there isn't a unitary, a Pan-African culture or Pan-African cultural philosophical worldviews. So if we were to just go with Black, diasporic, and maybe specifically African-American, I want to kind of highlight some philosophical worldviews and aesthetic qualities that will help us in our evaluation and in our exploration of Afrofuturism. So one is W.E.B. Du Bois's double consciousness, right? He talks about this kind of injury that Black people, the schism that we developed in our time in the United States under this color-based hierarchy or in the Western world, and this idea that we can both center ourselves in Europe, and at the same time, we can't center ourselves in Europe. We have to be centered in our own experience as Black folks. But at the same time, we can't really be who we are because we've got this white world trying to squash us. And so this leads us to this state of kind of schizophrenia and polarization internally, right? And Du Bois says, now this oftentimes results in a kind of madness, and this is the decentered and disempowered agent that Asante's talking about. But if we can hold it, it actually can be a source of strength because it gives us the ability to hop back and forth between worldviews. It gives us the ability to crossfade between worldviews. And this is where on the left here, you see Paul Miller, also known as DJ Spooky. He's a scholar of philosophy who's also involved in the music world, or at least at one time was, a kind of conceptual artist. And his view is that he then built on Du Bois's double consciousness, right, with the metaphor of the two turntables. And he basically says that we are in a state now where we have cultural fragments from all over the world that we can kind of pair together and create like not only a double consciousness, but a multiplex consciousness. We can create a kind of self that is made up of artistically and harmonically with the skill of improvisation is made up of multiple selves, okay? And so he says that Black people kind of establish that template and inhabit that space. And now through digital media, that's actually become the way that people create their identities culturally and individually, like worldwide, right? So what that leads to is this epistemic flexibility, this ability to construct knowledge and to filter the world in various ways, right? And Spooky is not alone in this. Paul Gilroy in his Black Atlantic also talks about, he says that Black people were some of the first modern and maybe even first postmodern people in the Western world, right? We were some of the first people to lose our identity and then have to create an identity on the spot. Another one is Amiri Baraka. And Amiri Baraka is actually deeply woven into the history of Naropa, as far as through the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics and the Summer Writing Program. And he has this beautiful essay called The Changing Same, R&B and the New Black Music. And in it, he kind of lays down certain qualities of Black aesthetics, and he links them back to what he refers to as spirit worship from traditional and indigenous African traditions. And he says this phenomenon is always at the root of Black art, the worship of spirit or the summoning of or by such force, right? So Black music is a communication of and with the spiritual forces. And it's a saying something. It isn't art for art's sake. It's art for the sake of communication. And communication seeks to move entities in relationship towards something purposeful. Okay. He also says Black music and art contains the fire, the promise, the need for evolution into a higher species. Right. So there's a push in Black art. I'm going to talk about a bit about that in a moment. So another element that you can find in Black art specifically, and in Black worldview, another point of evaluation is what Audre Lorde identified as the erotic. Okay, and she spoke about it specifically in the context of women and the lives of women and the way that patriarchal societies kind of make the erotic the province of women, but then when men want it, we try to get it. But we don't really want to be suffused by it, because if we were, it would change us, right? And the erotic it's not just what people do in bed. The erotic is it permeates your whole life, and it teaches you, it gives you a baseline for what feels good, right? And it becomes a way of evaluation, right? It becomes a way of encountering the world. It becomes an aliveness in our senses, and it's a knowing what is satisfying, right? And in a way, satisfaction is a kind of harmony. You're at rest, and you're a buzz, right? So another way to say it is the funky or the embodied, right? If it's not funky, if it doesn't hit, if it doesn't connect, if it doesn't feel good, it doesn't feel right in Black art, something didn't happen. Yeah. So this is kind of getting at what Amiri Baraka was saying at the end there. Black art, Black philosophy, Black scholarship, Black culture, not always, but in its most potent, is prophetic. Okay. We can't be content with the given. We can't be content with the world as it is, because the world as it is a world that is built up on our backs and for our degradation or for our marginalization. So we have to push for tomorrow. We have to push for something that we can't see, but we can feel, or we know that we need to feel, right? Angela Davis says here, being Black, it's like you have to act as if it were possible to transform the world radically, and you got to do it consistently. And this isn't exclusive to Black folks, and most of what I pointed out is not exclusive to Black folks. I'm really saying that it is central, or That's the assertion of the Afrocentric idea. These are central qualities to Black experience and Black philosophy movement. And the prophetic is future oriented. It's oriented towards what is not there. And the prophetic is willing to challenge the existing system. And like, you know, whether we want to talk about the Hebrew prophets or Marcus Garvey or you know, the Rastafarian movement, or pick your movement, but there is a knowledge that you have to challenge power. You have to challenge the powerful. You have to challenge those that are well seated in the existing system if you're going to create a new system, if you're going to create a new set of relationships, if you're going to realize a new way of being. Okay. And that's a futuristic impulse, but another impulse, and I believe that this is shared between those that refer to themselves specifically as Black and Africa, or the Afrocentric, is this evocation of the ancestors as a spiritual source. Okay. And when we're talking about world wisdom traditions, not exclusive to Black, but central and Black, the people that have gone and lived before us, their deeds, their struggles, their mishaps, their desires, okay, we can reach back and tap back into that well of wisdom, and we can use it in our lives. And that, in fact, our lives are actually an expression of the ancestors forward into time. And a lot of traditional African systems, you are seen as an ancestor who's reborn, who's seeking rebirth. And that the ancestors, your personal ancestors and the collective of ancestors, can provide guidance in a person's life about what their path is and help them over those moments of struggle. Right? So the ancestors is a sort of vast book, or this vast orature that can be drawn upon and that can reinfuse our lives. Okay? And that if you want to go forward, you got to go back first. All right, more on that later. So that forward and going back, okay, that's part of what is a powerful impulse in Afrofuturism. And one easy way that we could define Afrofuturism is just the future from the Black perspective, or an Afrocentric perspective. And that's the simplest starting point. We're going to go much deeper into it. But so let me move my little face here. So some Afrofuturist theorists have really started to work with this idea of Astro-Blackness. Okay. And Astro-Blackness, they define it as an Afrofuturistic concept in which a person's Black state of consciousness, released from the confining, crippling slave or colonial mentality, becomes aware of the multitude and varied possibilities and probabilities within the universe. So this is where we're questing after. This is our journey. This is our destination. This is our ship. This is the beginning. This is the end. This is the center. This is where we're at. This is where we're going. This is where we're looking for. It's what we're cultivating. Astro-Blackness. So that brings me close to the end of this presentation. I got one more thing for you.